Are there? I'm becoming more Australian every day. Anyway, this is where the Church of Nowhere applies its principle of what is really wrong to issues of the day. And of course, the main issue for the last 3 or 4 years, of course, has been the Brexit fiasco, and which is exactly what it is. Um, why do people really want to remain in the EU? That's the real question, really. And I think it goes back to a general liberal inspired dissatisfaction with Britain and the Britons. I mean, I was thinking of that footage, of those two protesters. Never mind what they were protesting, but the two protesters on top of that train being hauled off by an angry mob and practically looked like they were going to be killed. And then for this rotten little TV program called Good Morning Britain, whatever that is, comes on and justifies this yobbish action, and blames the protesters for upsetting people so much that they would commit homicide in order to get their silly train going again. Um, but I mean, I must say, and of course, being totally livid with the fact that this one of the co-founders or organisers of the protest movement, came on and said, "Well, at least we got ourselves onto this program. This is the only way we had to do it. If they hadn't put themselves on that train, you wouldn't be featuring us on your program," which made the little man on the right of the presenters absolutely livid. I mean, his eyes were darkening black, and he looked really like he could almost strangle the female uh, protester coordinator. And will you be doing anything more like this? And she was saying, well, I don't know. We're a decentralized organization, so how do I know how people are going to what people are going to do? It's up to them. They have to plan it themselves. They take responsibility for breaking the law if the laws are broken, and that's it. It's nothing to do with me. Which I thought was great, and they also made them very, very angry about that because they couldn't, lock anybody up. They couldn't get to any leaders. You know what the media is like. If you have leaders or leadership, they diss them. They find some peculiar picadillo or sexual problem that these people, that the leadership has, and then they splash it all over the newspapers, to discredit them. But if you haven't got any leaders, if your group hasn't got any leaders, you see, you can't do that. What can you do? Who can you go to complain? Who can you blackmail? Who can you threaten to kill? There isn't anyone ostensibly. Only a few coordinators, well, PR people really, and founders who are basically also PR people. Anyway, be that as it may, the point is that you sort of think to yourself, why does the human race actually need saving at all? But which is another point, I suppose. But go back to the original one about Brexit. I think a lot of people think that the average Briton, with obvious great exceptions, but without the Briton is a yobbo, is racist, um, obsessed with the pleasure principle, ravers, drug addicts, people who are addicted to computer games and social media, uh, very right wing, very Thatcherite, convinced that everybody is on welfare as a scrounger. The list goes on and on. Very parochial, petty-minded. They're the sort of people that you live next door to that come up to you, knock on your front door and say, "Your dog pissed on my cabbages. Don't like your dog pissing on your cabbages. Can't you control your dog?" And all that kind of person, really. And also very stressed. Obviously, the average Briton is very, very stressed. I mean, their working conditions, the average Briton now, are far worse than they were in the 1960s. Are far worse. I mean, I'm not laying the blame on that on anybody but the bosses, really. And people are very exploited nowadays, and they're used, and they haven't had a pay rise for years, and and expenses just keep going up and up and up. It's supposed to be a negative inflation or whatever, which is just a lie. So there's a lot of resentment and anger building up, which of course would explain why the Leave vote in 2016 was in fact a protest vote against everything, really. And some things that people are against are sort of intangibles, really. They're cultural problems which have taken many decades to unfold, such as counterculture and modern art and all the things that people hate about modernism, but also at the same time addicted to with their iPads and iPhones and mobile devices. They're all addicted to those, addicted to social media, and yet there's a sort of hatred of it as well. Like it's totally dominating your life, and you don't have any real friends, and you don't. And if you go to a pub or a club, you're just doing selfies and posting people and messaging people, and you're not actually there, are you? So there's lots of intangible things that I think people that wanted to leave the EU were voting against. Some of the things that possibly the EU are not even responsible for, really, which is a little bit unfair, really. But well, it's not unfair because I think the EU is a scam. I mean, I'm in favour of the Brotherhood of Man, but the EU is just a scam, and I think that's a good slogan. Really, it has a lot of truth to it. Um, I mean, Britain's already paid out £3 billion to the EU over the last 3 years of the Brexit fiasco. So it's clear that Britain is just a cash cow. You just milk Britain for all its money, and of course this builds up a lot of resentment as well. But from the liberal Guardian reader's point of view, I mean, the post-Brexit society is a society to actually fear. And I think that I mean, people like to say, oh, well, racism only exists in places in Britain which are not have nothing to do with any ethnic community apart from the white community. I don't know whether this is true or not. They're trying to say that people in Notting Hill get on really, really well with each other because it's so multiracial and multicultural. Maybe that was true, in the heady days of Tony Blair being the PM of Britain, but I'm not sure that's so true anymore now. It seems to me, and I think a lot of people are now beginning to say, it seems like Britain is a hostile country to immigrants, and a hostile country to alternative people generally, and with all the paranoia over Al Qaeda and 9/11 and terrorism and the London bombings. People are paranoid. People are jacked, really, as they say, jacked and stressed about life and about relationships going down the chute because of money problems and all this. Which money problems being the number one killer of relationships, really. And I think a lot of it reminds me a bit of Yugoslavia. That the atmosphere in Yugoslavia before it all blew up, was one of deep resentment and hatred of the Communist Party, all right, but also, as it turned out, hatred of everybody else as well, hatred of your neighbour. Hate your neighbour as yourself, literally, like you hate yourself and you hate your neighbour and you hate society and you hate the country and you hate the whole world. It's not a very healthy package, and of course, all exacerbated by the fact, I suppose, that the Guardian readers of Britain haven't known that any of this has been going along, and if there's a massive civil war, it'll be a surprise to them. They'll say, what's the problem? Because they live in ivory towers and they don't realise what ordinary people are going through nowadays. And they don't realise that the sort of head of steam that's building up of resentment and hatred, cultural hatred, not even racial hatred, but cultural hatred within races, not just between races, but within them as well. So it's all a bit dispersed. I mean, luckily, I suppose Britain is such a variegated society that I don't suppose really that it will come to much apart from a few Twitter storms and dramas on social media. But there's a lot of unpleasantness about in social media and on the internet. A lot of name calling, a lot of fear mongering on both sides of the Brexit debate, and a lot of unpleasant language, unhelpful language being used by both sides. And despite the fact that some of the parliamentary debates on Brexit have been very, very good, actually, and have been of high quality, high calibre, but also a lot of pettiness and blockiness and filibustering and all this kind of stuff has been going on as well. So a lot of the upshot is, I think, in a lot of post-Brexit society, I think a lot of liberal people will want to leave. I mean, maybe they won't want to go and live in Spain because there are problems with between Britain and Spain, but because there aren't much problems between Ireland and Republic of Ireland and Britain because of the CTA, the Common Travel Area Agreement, I think a lot of liberals, I predict a lot of liberals will be coming over to Ireland to live, to get away from what they see as a sort of a march towards fascism on the part of Britain, hooliganism, Yahooism, just general unpleasantness. And of course, ironically enough, although they may not want to admit this, of course, there are lots of areas of Britain that don't have any white people, hardly any white people living in them. And where these areas are but areas of either mixed race or white race people, you're going to get problems on the edges. And problems of apartheid in the education system, people taking their kids out of school because of their being picked on or left out in the playgroup because they're white. So I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't a grain of truth in what some people that are called racists are saying. It's just that it is an unpleasant atmosphere to live in, and likely to get worse. But on the other hand, I suspect also, ironically enough, things might get a little better if Britain is allowed to leave the EU, because they'll feel more insecure. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of people that are into Brexit are feeling more very insecure about belonging to the EU and about being sucked into their sort of monolithic ideology. And perhaps Britain, when it has its own sovereignty, which of course is illusory anyway, I know that, but when it appears to have its own sovereignty, perhaps the right wing will be more secure and will settle down and be less belligerent and hostile and confrontational, and sort of less victim. There'd be less of a victim mentality coming from the right wing. But of course, there'd be a lot of victim mentality from the left wing. But either the left wingers liberals can leave the country, or they can continue to be victims, which they are used to being. I mean, let's face it. If you're left wing or liberal, you always were a victim, really, of conservatism and compliance and people's conformity. You always did feel out in the cold, really, right back in the last century, and the noughties and everywhere. It was only under Tony Blair that you thought you were taken seriously, but in fact you weren't, really. And Britain doesn't have any sovereignty. No country has any sovereignty because they're all under the WTO, World Trade Organization, IMF, corporations. Corporations back the EU, and the corporations back the anti-EU, and the corporations back the non-EU. They back everybody because they're sort of like the cotton factories of northern England during the Napoleonic Wars that supplied uniforms to both sides, to the French and the English. I mean, they were making profit out of the war, and that was it, really. And that's what the corporations do. Is as long as there's profit to be made, they really don't care who they back or what they do. To be perfectly honest with you, when all is said and done. Given they can get away, if they can get away with as much as they can, they will. Do you know what I mean? Laws and international treaties notwithstanding, because there's always some loophole that you can find legally in order to continue to make vast profits. So, there's always some loophole that hasn't been covered by legislation or international treaty. So there's all to play for, basically, if you're a corporation hungry for power and money. But I also say that corporations are not that bad, because corporations are more sensitive, I suppose, to public feeling now and more sensitive to what governments think of them. So they don't really want to get too up themselves and too big for their boots. You see, no society, no element in society, no group in society is really allowed to get above and beyond, too big for its boots. Really, I mean that's one of the things about a democracy is that you can't have one group actually dominating another all the other groups for very long. I mean, they do it for a while, but they can't sustain it. You see. And then things keep changing. The quicksands of the internet and the quicksands of power mean that every dog has his day, but you get eaten by another dog. So anyway, so I'm not sure what's really wrong with Brexit. I hope I've covered the sort of main points, and I think a lot of people, Brexit isn't really an issue. It's more of a symbol. It's more of a symbol of discontent on both sides of this fence, if it exists at all, which it probably doesn't, only in the minds of people that have created it.